Hello and welcome
Hi.
to the late running final vodcast for LIT115 on the Wolfman. So today we will talk about the following things. Context, who is the Wolfman, that kind of stuff, the idea of memory, touching again on ideas of species being, ideas of the human, ideas of the animal, referring back to both Marx and Darwin, touch briefly on religion, which we talked a little bit about in class, not very much. Fabienne will take over at that point and talk about the pleasure principle and transference, cannibalism, and Deleuze and guitar. So, who is the Wolfman? This is the Wolfman with his brill-creamed hair and nutty moustache. Sergei Pankachev, a Russian aristocrat who comes from a very depressed family. Both his sister and his father committed suicide. He suffered himself from terrible depression, inordinate constipation, and a bout of gonorrhea. So when he arrived in Vienna in 1910, aged 24, to receive the treatment of Dr. Freud, he was not in a good way. And the Wolfman is the story of his analysis. And he's someone who never stopped haunting Freud, and I think it's fair to say that Freud never stopped haunting him. So the Wolfman as a text comes from the History of an Infantile Neurosis from 1918, and it's a text in which Freud locates the origins of adult symptoms in childhood events. So a text that looks back from the adult present to the past of the childhood. It is an account of the patient's symptoms, an account of the analytic process, and a key text in the development of Freud's notorious theory of infantile sexuality. It's a text that swithers between confidence and provisionality. So Freud writes, theoretical contradictions are for the most part fruitless, however. As soon as we begin to move away from the material that should be our source, we run the risk of being intoxicated by our own assertions. Freud does not wish to be intoxicated by his own assertions, but wishes to ground his discussion of the analysis in something as close to science as he can get it. But it's also a text in which Freud is engaged with defending the psychoanalytic process against its various detractors, particularly Jung and Adler. So as Abraham Torok wrote in their study of this text, The Wolfman's Magic Word, the text is intended to shore up the cardinal tenets of constituting psychoanalysis as Freud had invented it, the unconscious, infantile sexuality, the Oedipus complex, against attacks from these two former disciples. We can say more about the kind of text Wolfman is by thinking about it as something that has tentacles penetrating into various different genres. So most self-evidently, it's one of Freud's case histories, a term that does what it says on the tin. It offers a history of a medical case. But we may also see it as a horror story, and because of that, a Gothic novella that draws very explicitly at times on the tradition of fairy stories. It's also, as you will see, particularly at the joints between the chapters, a detective story that generates explicitly a metafictional sense of the psychoanalyst as detective, trying to work out the puzzle that sets before him and staging out the clues to you in various moments of the narrative. It's also, thinking now about the themes, a text which is one of the most explicit and detailed engagement with the ideas of memory. And memory, of course, is a very complex idea that plays a key part in the narrative drama of the Wolfman as a literary and psychoanalytic text, but also it plays a key role in the psychoanalytic process. So memories are very eloquent in Freud's schema. But importantly, memory is not stable, fixed, and consistent. So there's a fascinating interpenetration between memory and fantasy in the Wolfman. He writes on page 250, "These previously unconscious memories do not even need to be true. They may be true, but their truth is often distorted and interspersed with fantasized elements. in a very similar way to so-called cover memories that have been spontaneously retained from the distant past. I will say only that scenes such as we find in my patient's case, from such an early age and with such content, which then lay claim to such extraordinary significance for the history of the case, are not as a rule reproduced as memories, but must be guessed at, reconstructed, from the sum total of indications, step by step, and with considerable effort. So in the second of the two highlighted sections of that quotation, memory is not a given, something reconstructed, guessed at, something that is collaborative in the process of analysis between the analyst and the analysand, and may well be distorted and interspersed with fantasy. So we think of real and fantasy as polar opposites, and we think characteristically as memory as something that records, like a video recorder, the reality of our experience in the world. Not so, says Dr. Freud. Fantasy and memory are always already imbricated in one another. And this also involves an adjustment of what we might think of as conventional conceptions of time. There is often a great deal more of the past in the future than there was in the past itself at the time, and a rather convoluted expression of Anne Thackeray Richard. There is often a great deal more of the past in the future than there was in the past itself at the time. So the future, how we will continue to act in the world, is situated in relation to past events. But these past events are not present to the time. So memory retrieves, constructs, invents things that then shape the future. So the future is always shaped in relation to fantastic memories. Perhaps we may say something akin to Marx's idea, or the idea associated with Marx, of a false consciousness. This shows one of the many ways in which psychoanalysis is a natural sibling to literature, and particularly modernist literature. So modernist literature, so the literature at the start of the 20th century when Freud publishes this text, is greatly concerned with recovering the past and also trying to work out the instability of the past and its relationship to the future. So just 4 years after this is published, Eliot begins his famous poem, The Wasteland, with the lines, "The April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." So if memory is always interspersed with fantasy in Freud's terms, then memory is always mixed with desire in Eliot's terms. And this long quotation from Taekyung Kwon on the other side of the screen gives us a few more details about how memory works in Freud's psychic architecture. Sigmund Freud's celebrated case study from the history of an infantile neurosis, 1918, more closely resembles a literary work than it does a meticulously composed scientific record, given that it provides seemingly infinite possibilities for reinterpretation. The study not only describes the process involved in the interpretation of dreams, but it also outlines the structure of remembering through deferred acts, along with repetition and transference. Indeed, the style of the writing itself is seemingly intended to call attention to the way in which science and literature are dynamically synthesized, so fact and the imagination merge in the text, and the manner in which the mode of remembering functions in the study's dialectic. As Derrida observes, the theory of psychoanalysis then becomes a theory of the archive, and not only a theory of memory. So he's not only accessing the memories of the individual analysand, but also a larger archive, a repository of text of previous uses of language, which might be important in the analytical process. So, significantly in Freud's case study of the so-called Wolfman, memory, or more accurately, remembering or recollection, so dynamic rather than fixed processes, serves as the key elements given its role as the kernel of Freudian repression. Perhaps the numerous rereadings of this single empirical scientific study are due to its treatment of memory, which is, after all, the most mysterious structure of the human mind. So memory is both mysterious and dynamic. Memory is not just a fixed bank of stuff that happened in the past that you may retrieve, but the dynamic process of remembering and recollecting something that is ongoing, creative and fantastic, as well as an act of retrieval. A brief reflection on how ideas of memory and its connection to fantasy invite us to think back to a point we've made already on this module about the biological hauntings of psychoanalysis. So this is how Freud ends the Wolfman, or this is nearly at the end anyway. This concludes what I wish to say about this case. Only two of the numerous problems to which it gives rise seem to me to deserve particular emphasis. The first concerns those phylogenetically transmitted patterns that, like philosophical categories, enable us to accommodate our impressions of life. I should like to suggest that they are the precipitates of human cultural history. They are what cause or drive human history. The Oedipus complex, a complete account of the child's relationship to his parents, is one example, indeed the best known. When experiences cannot be fitted into this hereditary schema, they are reworked in the imagination. We are often in a position to note how the schema takes precedence over individual experience. So the idea of phylogeny, a species being, is something that overwhelms or takes priority over the individual experience. So we think of memory as being something that happens to you as an individual being, but also in Freud's schema, this functions phylogenetically as something in which species being participates, something that transcends individual humanity. So this takes us on to a topic which emerges very strongly in the Wolfman, which is the idea of species being. And this is an idea, the question of the animal, so to speak, is something that concerns Freud from the beginning, and his ideas in the interpretation of dreams. He asks, what do geese dream of? Geese dream of grain, so he uses this to represent the idea of dreams as wish fulfillments. He also sees psychoanalysis as being one of three blows to human exceptionalism. The first of these is the cosmological blow related to Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, discovering in the 14th century that the Earth is not the centre of the universe. Darwin provides the biological blow, and Freud himself administers the psychological blow to the sense that humans are exceptional amongst all terrestrial creatures. So this takes us into the idea of instinct, a very closely related idea to that of memory. What is instinct but species memory? If we consider the way in which the 4-year-old responds to the reactivated primal scene, indeed we have only to think of the far simpler reactions of the 18-month-old child to the original experience, it is difficult to dismiss the notion that some kind of knowledge that resists definition, a sort of preparation for understanding, is at work in the child. What this might consist in defies the imagination. The only analogy available to us is the excellent analogy with a largely instinctive knowledge found in animals. So it's just an analogy in Freud's thought, but that analogy is significant in this reconfiguring of individual human experience in relation to species being. So the idea that some kind of larger force flows through or informs psychic experience. We arrive at the uncanny, irresistible gaze of these creatures, perched strangely in this dead tree, sitting quite still in the branches, not moving at all, and looking right at me. So this is a powerful moment of the confrontation of the human with its animal other. And I'll linger briefly over this idea, thinking to Derrida's essay in The Animal That Therefore I Am, More to Follow, in which, as we probably mentioned before, the great philosopher Derrida is encountered while naked by his cat and uses this as an example to think about the instability of human identity and the difficulty of narrating the story of the human to itself, motivated by the experience of shame he feels caught in the eyes of his cat. And this gaze that the patient insists on, I think, is a very significant part of the kind of primal ontological insecurity he experiences, these animals staring right at you out of the screen. There's a lot of animals in the story that leads us to ponder what they actually mean, or how Dr. Freud's bestiary functions. So these 5 wolves in that illustration of the scene perched in the tree relate perhaps only ambiguously to Canis lupus, the biological wolf. Animals in the Wolfman function differently. They are symbols, they represent larger patterns, they are symptoms, they are something that emerges because of an underlying psychic condition, or we might think they are characters in the narrative of Freud's psychoanalytic investigation. They are also objects of terror, disgust, and violence, strangely all woven together. And this leads us to ponder the question of whether animals are real or imaginary, just as we may ask of memory whether that might be real, whether that might be fantastic. The story invites us to think of the interplay between material, real-world engagements between humans and creatures and the psychic function of animals in psychoanalytic readings. So this disturbing scene, on one occasion the Wolfman was chasing after a lovely big butterfly with yellow striped wings that had pointed tips, trying to catch it, so it starts like a children's story. Suddenly he was seized, he wasn't sized, by a dreadful fear of the creature and gave up his pursuit, screaming. Now it's a Gothic novella. He also experienced fear and disgust at the sight of beetles and caterpillars. A little bit of a Gustavian objection there, and yet he was able to recall that at the same period he had tortured beetles and cut up caterpillars. Horses also gave him an uncanny feeling. He would scream if a horse was beaten and once left the circus for this reason. On other occasions he enjoyed beating horses himself. Very bizarre moment. So the fluctuation between different modes of ethical or non-ethical engagement with animals, how none of this is fixed, but kind of different moods seize him between fear, disgust, terror, and this irresistible drive towards violence. So this shows the way in which psychic dynamics are written into the material world, how desire and confliction is part of history and part of our relationship with other creatures. These are actual horses that he enjoyed beating, apparently. But this beating of horses is him enacting these psychic dramas. So what happens on the mind, of course, is a part of how we involve ourselves with the world. This equates to a kind of substitution. So the way in which he acts out his psychic life with the animals shows his act that the animals kind of substituting or standing in for other parts of his kind of tormenting psychic formation. And religion operates a bit like this. So religion stands in for the stuff that's going on in his head. These first brooding thoughts circling around the person of Christ already contain the question as to whether this sublime son could also fulfill the sexual relationship to his father that the patient had retained in his unconscious. So Christianity in particular is greatly concerned with fathers, as is psychoanalysis. So that the natural process of substitution, particularly given he's born on Christmas Day, between his actual father and God the Father, is something that forms an important part of Freud's analysis. And after he stops torturing animals, religion becomes the next substitute, the next way in which he acts out his psychic troubles in the world. Piety becomes the dominant power of the child's life. These efforts of will are not achieved without a struggle, however. Its signs are the appearance of blasphemous thoughts and its consequence, the onset of a compulsive religious ritual. So there's a compulsion towards faith and piety in the Wolfman. So it becomes slightly pathological, as Freud writes earlier, in obsessive actions and religious practices. I'm certainly not the first person to have been struck by the resemblance between what are called obsessive actions in sufferers from nervous affections and the observances by means of which believers give expression to their piety. The term ceremonial, which has been applied to some of these obsessive actions, is evidence of this. So many religions are concerned with rituals, repetitions, obsessive compulsive behaviour, where you act out again and again and again particular forms of piety or kind of modes of sanctity. That is a pathological psychic symptom, we may cynically argue.
Yes, well, so I wanted to just talk briefly about pleasure principle and the concept of transference, which John mentioned already briefly, just to see about how Freud arrives from his practice of psychoanalysis to the theory about the formation of the subject. He had to be educated for a long time before he could be persuaded to take an independent interest in our work, and when, as a result of his efforts, the first moments of release occurred, he suspended the work immediately to prevent any further possibility of change and maintain the comfortableness of the former situation. There was only one way of overcoming it. I had to wait until his attachment to me had grown strong enough to counterbalance it, and then I played the one factor against the other. So here Freud is talking about the pleasure principle kicking in, which also actually affects the way, if you're ill, you might feel more comfortable in your illness than having to go through psychoanalysis, which obviously dredges up that which is repressed and which causes unpleasure. So one way that the subject or the analysant might refuse psychoanalysis is because there's a relative comfortableness in being ill. So the other green part there refers to that phenomenon of transference, where it's an attachment to the psychoanalyst, both actually in terms of hate and love, which figures quite prominently in Freudian psychoanalysis. So on the right-hand side of the slide, his fixed determination to remain ill gave way, and that fixed determination to remain ill is connected up to the pleasure principle of wanting to refuse to confront that which is repressed. Just a quick quotation from Beyond the Pleasure Principles to elucidate that. The facts which have caused us to believe in the dominance of the pleasure principle in mental life also find expression in the hypothesis that the mental apparatus endeavours to keep the quantity of excitation present in it as low as possible, or at least to keep it constant. That's obviously something that we've seen already, the pleasure principle as the principle of constancy, but that might also refer to that kind of relative comfortableness of an illness. The impairment of the drive to eat, which may of course have other causes as well, draws our attention to the fact that the organism has not succeeded in controlling sexual excitement. The sexual objective in this phase could only be cannibalism, eating. In our patient's case, this comes to the fore as a result of regression from a higher level in his fear of being gobbled up by the wolf. We had to translate this fear as that of being taken in coitus by the father. It's quite interesting to look at this because here you see that the ego is this fragile creature that we've seen in the ego and the id, this fear of being taken up, this fear of being dissolved, and so here it becomes pathological. So it's interesting to see that at work in one of Freud's case studies. I'm going to talk a little bit to finish about two French psychoanalysts and theorists, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who take issue with Freud's work in many ways. They wrote a book called Anti-Oedipus together, and the title says it all already. In Anti-Oedipus, they write that the two of us wrote the book together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. So what they're doing in their work is refusing the project of psychoanalysis as a conservative process of accommodating the subject to the world as it is. And what they're doing in their work, Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. They're talking about the Wolfman in one of the quite short chapters in an otherwise massive book. But in these books, they're exploring possibilities of different ways of thinking through psychoanalysis. And one of the ways that they propose to do that, and the sort of collective writing is part of that, it's a sort of writing in an anti-ontological way. It is this kind of concept of schizoanalysis as a way to oppose the reification of the subject, or also the formulation of the subject as something that always refers back to a stable centre. The stable centre would, in Freudian psychoanalysis, be the Oedipus complex overwhelmingly. So no sooner does Freud discover the greatest art of the unconscious, this art of molecular multiplicities, then we find him tirelessly at work bringing back molar unities, reverting to his familiar themes of the father, the penis, the vagina. So this idea of the molar identity is interesting and something that they develop throughout 1,000 Plateaus specifically. Molar identity is a sort of identity that is all about wholeness, about stable subjectivity, and this molar unity, the Deleuze and Guattari associate above all with the father. So it's a project also that refuses patriarchy in favour of a subject that is multiple and what they call sort of constituted through intensities that are moving and dynamic, a bit like John was talking about memory. So the subject itself is something that is dynamic rather than fixed as a sort of molar identity, which might be the impression that you get from Freud's work. Deleuze and Guattari argue instead that the subject is a sort of swarm or a pack of wolves, and it's about not establishing the unity of a molar identity, but about refusing the domestication of multiplicity. So the wolf, as the instantaneous apprehension of a multiplicity in a given region, is not a representative, a substitute, but an I feel. I feel myself becoming a wolf, one wolf among others on the edge of the pack. A cry of anguish, the only one Freud hears. Help me not become a wolf, or the opposite, help me not fail in this becoming. It is not a question of representation. Don't think for a minute that it has to do with believing oneself a wolf, representing oneself as a wolf. The wolves are intensities, speeds, temperatures, non-decomposable variable distances, a swarming, wolfing. So this kind of swarming, wolfing is that kind of opposition to a stable molar identity, and it's about refusing to domesticate the kind of multiplicities and also the animal others that constitute the so-called human in the first place. So it's about being attentive and to attend to those animal others as well. So that's, I think, it. So when it comes to the workshop tasks, we want you to make notes for a detailed close reading of the dream scene on page 227, and also think about how does the analytic process utilize memory and fantasy and the relationship between them. Select relevant examples from the text. Thanks very much and have a lovely weekend.
Goodbye.
Bye.